everybody. We're back with Appalachian Ghost Stories and Other Tales, Part 2. And we're going to talk about Kale Betts' Ghost. This is Story 1. About 3 miles below Grantsville, in the Little Kanawha River Valley, is a place once known as the Kale Betts Farm. Shortly after Kale Betts disappeared, a ghost came to the farm home, which led the members of the family to suspect that Kale had been murdered and that this was his ghost. The subsequent events that occurred thereabouts became so notorious, the national attention was directed to the place through the newspapers of that time. Apart from the news media, there has been a considerable amount of oral information about the ghost that has passed from generation to generation to this day in that area of the valley. The rambunctious ghost became so disturbing to the Betts family that Kale's son Collins decided to build a new house at another place on the farm. Just as soon as that house was completed, the family moved into it and then tore down the old house. Thereafter, the Betts family lived undisturbed in their new home. Sometime after the old house had been razed, the ghost moved to the home of a farmer who lived nearby. Members of this family at times became disturbed when they felt a light breeze as the invisible ghost moved past them. The children were often frightened when the ghost either inadvertently or purposely tripped them while they played about their home. All sorts of noises were heard in and about the house at night, none of which could be logically explained. Although the farmer always barred the doors at night, they were often found open when morning came, even when there was not the slightest wind blowing. On one occasion, the lights were blown out as fast as they could be relit. These unexplainable happenings so frightened the family that to continue to live there became untenable. As soon as another house at the other end of the farm could be made ready, the family moved into it. In doing so, not only their former well-kept farmhouse was deserted, but the garden, the orchard, and other possessions of the family at the old homestead were completely abandoned. It is believed the ghost must have become lonesome when it found itself alone in the old farmhouse, because it soon thereafter made its appearance at the nearest highway, where it apparently tried to communicate with a passerby. However, for some time, its efforts seemed to be fruitless and only frightened those who saw it. On one occasion, some boys suddenly came upon the ghost and began to throw stones at it. When they saw that the stones went through the ghost without affecting it, they fled in terror. When young Tom Van Devener was riding in his wagon along the road one night about a half mile from the Betts farm, his thoughts were far away from his immediate surroundings. Only a pale moonlight filtered through the clouds, yet visibility was sufficient for keeping in the roadway without undue difficulty. After a time, Tom became aware of what he thought was a man walking in the road just ahead of his horses. For some distance, they traveled in this manner, with the man seemingly unaware of the nearness of the horses to him. When Tom tightened on the reins to slacken the pace of the horses, the phantom man glided, without any noise, back past the horses, climbed into the wagon, and sat down on the seat beside Tom. To state that Tom did not cry out or run does not mean he was not afraid. The truth is, he was so scared he could not move or even speak. In that condition, he rode along with the ghost for several hundred yards. He was afraid to look directly at the ghost, but through the corner of his eye it appeared to him to be headless. Yet it talked to him. It told him not to be afraid, for it would not harm him. Also, it warned him not to say anything about his seeing it until the old moon had gone out and a new moon had come in. Then it glided noiselessly off the wagon and disappeared into the woods. Many people thereabouts believed, as the members of the Betts family did, that Kale Betts had been murdered. Moreover, they regarded the appearance of the ghost as his uneasy spirit seeking retribution for the crime. Story number 2. Wizard's Clip and the Exorcist. In 1790, Adam Livingston moved his family from Pennsylvania to a 75-acre farm adjoining the village of Middleway in Jefferson County, Virginia, now West Virginia. About 4 years after settling there, a middle-aged stranger came and asked for board and lodging in the Livingston home. Since only 2 of the 7 Livingston children were living at home at the time, it was thought there would be ample room for the stranger, and he was permitted to stay. Only a few days after the arrival of the stranger, he became ill. When his condition became worse, he called Adam to his bedside, informed him he was a Roman Catholic, and asked if there was a priest in the neighborhood. Thereupon Adam, who was an intensely bigoted member of the Lutheran Church, replied that he knew of none, and even if there were any, he would never knowingly permit a Catholic priest to cross the threshold of his house. When the stranger realized he was going to die, he pleaded desperately for spiritual solace. But Adam turned a deaf ear and allowed the man to die without the comforting aid of a priest. Following the death of the stranger, Adam employed Jacob Foster, a young man of the community, to set up with the corpse through the night. When darkness approached, some new candles were brought in and lit. These candles, however, would not burn. As fast as they were lit, the fire flickered momentarily and then died out. Thinking their newness prevented them from burning properly, Adam brought in 2 older candles from his own room, and which had already burned about a third down. These were lit and placed on tables on opposite sides of the room, but immediately flickered out and left the room in darkness. Foster now became so frightened he ran out of the house and never returned. So Adam had to keep the wake with the corpse of the stranger. The next night after the burial of the stranger, Adam was awakened by a noise that sounded like horses galloping round his house. He arose and went to a window to see what the commotion might be. He looked out into the bright moonlit night, but there were no horses to be seen. In the days that immediately followed this incident, there came a series of misfortunes to Adam Livingston. It was a time of such confusion that of all the narrators of the events of that time, it appears that no 2 have presented them in the same order of occurrence. Perhaps Adam himself, in his time of troubles, did not remember the time order in which they came. Nevertheless, there was the report that crockeryware jumped off the tables and broke on the floor. A huge rope closed off the road in front of the house and then just as mysteriously disappeared. All his money was taken away, his barn burned, and all his cattle died. And coals of fire jumped out of the fireplace and danced about on the floor. Throughout this time, Adam was greatly annoyed, but seemed to meet these apparent tricks of witchery with stoic fortitude. But when the chilling clip of the wizard's scissors came, he was terrified. First, the heads of Miss Livingston's turkeys, chickens, and ducks were clipped off. Then, the clipping of the shears could be heard in the various rooms of the Livingston house. Within a period of 2 or 3 weeks, the scissors had clipped half moons and other curious shaped designs in the blankets, counterpanes, sheets, clothing, and draperies. Even Adam's boots and saddles did not escape the wizard's shears. Word of the strange occurrences at the Livingston homestead soon spread much beyond the village of Middleway. An elderly lady of Martinsburg heard about it, and to satisfy her curiosity, decided to visit the Livingstons and see for herself. On her arrival at the Livingston homestead, and before leaving her carriage, she removed her black cap, folded it neatly in a silk handkerchief, and placed it in her pocket so it would not be clipped by the wizard's scissors. Then she went inside the house. After visiting there for about a half hour, she came out and entered her carriage to return home. When she removed the handkerchief from her pocket and unfolded it, she found her silk cap cut into narrow ribbons. 3 brash young men of Winchester, on hearing the strange tales being circulated about the wizard, announced they did not believe such reports and would prove them baseless if given an opportunity. On their arrival at the Livingston home, they explained their mission and were graciously invited to spend the night there. That night, while the 3 men sat in the living room and made trite remarks about people who believed in wizardry, a large stone came out of the fireplace and with great speed whizzed about the room. In terror, the men fled from the house. They could hardly believe they had escaped from such a hazard without being harmed. Their sudden departure from Winchester indicated they had no further desire to question the presence of the wizard. The mental torture that Adam Livingston suffered day and night without any relief brought him to the verge of nervous exhaustion. Now desperately seeking help, he had 3 self-styled conjurers to come and try to get the wizard out of the house, but they failed. During one night of fitful sleeping, Adam dreamed of climbing a high mountain. On reaching the mountaintop, he saw a person dressed in a black robe standing there. As he gazed upon the man, he heard a voice say, "This is the one who can save you." When Adam awoke, he still recalled the dream in vivid detail. Yet he was adamant about not having a Catholic priest in his house. Then the thought came to him that the black-robed person in his dream could have represented a minister of the Protestant faith. He knew an Episcopal minister who wore a robe in his church services, so he went to him for help. That minister, however, told Adam he could not help him. Finally, Adam came to the conclusion he would have to see a Catholic priest to get relief from his troubles. At that time in Leetown, a village only a few miles east of Middleway, there lived the McSherry family, who were of the Roman Catholic faith. To them, Adam went seeking the whereabouts of a priest. Miss McSherry informed him that the Reverend Dennis Cahill would be at the Catholic Church in Shepherdstown on the following Sunday. When Sunday came, Adam arose early and rode over to Shepherdstown. He soon located the Catholic Church, entered, and sat down in a pew near the door. When the priest came out to the altar, tears came to Adam's eyes as he whispered audibly, "That is the man I saw in my dream. I'm sure he can help me." When the church service was over, Adam met the Reverend Cahill and explained his situation to him. Thereupon, the priest accompanied Adam back to Middleway. The priest's first act on arriving there was to sprinkle holy water throughout the interior of Adam's house. Soon thereafter, Adam's money, which had disappeared earlier, was returned to the front door sill. The clipping noise, however, continued. The priest next suggested that Mass be celebrated in the house. At the conclusion of the Mass, the clipping sound stopped. Never again did the wizard disturb the Livingston home. Because of these strange occurrences, the village of Middleway was known for over a half-century afterward as Wizard Clip and Clip Town. That is the end of story 2. All right, everybody, we're on story number 3. Suffer not a witch to live. Jim Bonner's farm was widely known as one of the best in the whole Little Kanawha River Valley. It consisted mostly of rich bottom land, none of which, as far as anyone could recall, had ever been underwater with the highest of floods in the river. Through good farming practices, the Bonners grew in wealth and lived with considerable affluence in their community. On the hill back of the Bonner farm lived Jake Spittle and his wife, Virgie, on a rocky, submarginal farm from which they barely eked out an existence. Neither inheritance nor environment had been kind to Virgie. Her reddish, scraggly hair, beady dark eyes, high cheekbones, and long aquiline nose made her grossly unattractive. Moreover, her custom of wearing her husband's old slouch hat and rubbing snuff with a spicewood twig only added to her grotesque appearance and earned for her the name of Virgie the Witch. Good God. Okay, sorry about that. The first evidence of any unusual developments in the relations of the two families came after a dispute over a request by the Spittles for a right-of-way through the Bonner farm. They wanted to exchange a part of their farm for a strip of land to the river, but the Bonners refused. A short time after this, when the two Bonner boys were passing through the Spittle farm, Virgie confronted them and threatened to put a hex on them if they were ever caught on her farm again. The boys reported the threat to their mother, who, not wanting to take any chances, promptly sewed a buckeye in a pocket of each of the boys' trousers to protect them from the evil eye of Virgie. From this point on, a number of inconveniences began to affect the Bonner household. First, the milk suddenly became blink, then blood appeared in the eggs, and soon thereafter 3 pigs choked to death because their breathing passages became clogged with grubs. Although these were not entirely new experiences, it did seem unusual to the Bonners that they came so soon after Virgie had made known her possession of the hex power. Grandpa Bonner, who had received a leg wound in the Civil War, spent much of his time at the Bonner house in his favorite rocking chair on the front porch and whiled away the time by reading his Bible, swatting flies, and catnapping. One day, when one of the Bonner boys was suffering from a painful toothache, Grandpa pointed out to his ailing grandson a tree that had been struck by lightning and asked him to get a piece of limb that had been severed from the tree. As soon as the boy returned with the limb, Grandpa extracted a splinter with which he rubbed the environs of the boy's aching tooth. When this failed to relieve the boy of his pain, Grandpa said with some vehemence, "There's got to be a witch back of this. It's my guess that Spittle woman is up to her tricks again." The next afternoon, when Grandpa awakened from a catnap, he was surprised to see emerge from the cornfield below the house a white deer with an ear of corn in its mouth. When Jim came in from work and was told about the deer, he went out to see what damage had been done to his corn. he found the deer still there. It was going from row to row and jerking the ears of corn from the stalks and leaving them on the ground. Jim hurried back to the house, got his rifle, and returned to the cornfield. When he was within 30 feet of the deer, he took careful aim and fired. The deer, however, showed no evidence of having been hit, nor was alarmed at the noise of the gunfire. It continued to jerk corn from the stalks. Twice more Jim fired at the deer without any apparent effect on it. He could only shake his head in disbelief because he was sure he had not missed it. When he learned what had happened, Grandpa shook his head too. When he got excited, his short chin whiskers seemed to dance. "That deer is bewitched," he cried. "The Bible says, 'Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live.'" When Grandpa suggested that a silver bullet be made from a dime with which to kill the deer and break the witch's spell, Jim thought of it as just another of his father's many superstitions. However, just to please him, he made a silver bullet and loaded his rifle with it. Although night had come by this time, the moonlight was sufficient for Jim to see his way to the cornfield. When he located the deer, it stood facing him in a bold and defiant manner. Slowly and with great care, he took aim and fired. The deer sprang into the air, then fell heavily to the ground. A trickle of blood oozed from the bullet wound above its left eye. The most that had been expected from the use of a silver bullet was to break the hex power of Virgie spittle. Therefore, it was a distinct surprise to the Bonner family when word came that Virgie had been found dead in bed the next morning. The doctor who examined her reported that the cause of her death was a massive hemorrhage of the brain. That's the end of story 3, y'all. All right, we're going to start story number 4, Murder in the Meadow. When Joe Harper and Veda Mounts were married on April 20th, 1917, it came as a distinct surprise to the people of their community. Since Joe and Veda had never been more than casual friends and were never known to have gone out together on dates, people looked upon their marriage as somewhat unusual. It soon dawned on some of their acquaintances, however, that Joe might be looking for a way to avoid being drafted into the military service. If that had been his motive, it failed to help him, because when his draft number came up, the Selective Service Board ignored his marital status and instructed him to report to the induction center. Before leaving home, Joe warned the young men of the community to stay clear of his house and his wife while he was gone. Before the year was out, Veda was notified that Joe was missing in action. Soon thereafter, Rammer Larch, a young man who lived on an adjoining farm, moved in with Veda. Even though there was outspoken disapproval of their living together under such an arrangement, they appeared to ignore the criticism completely. Rammer's friends reminded him of Joe's warning before he left home. Moreover, they pointed out that it was possible that Joe was still alive and might return home without any forewarning. Rammer was not impressed with their admonitions and informed them that he would take his chances. Some people in the community hoped that the Red Men, a former local vigilante group, would be revived to teach Rammer and Veda a durable lesson in proper behavior. If any action was ever taken toward a revival of that highly clandestine group, it came too late. One afternoon, when Rammer came in from work, Veda told him that she had seen a man standing at the timberline on the hill opposite the house. He was dressed in dark clothes and was accompanied by a black, shaggy dog. For several minutes, he stood there motionless while gazing intently down at the house. Then abruptly, he turned and disappeared into the woods. She led Rammer to the window to point out the place where she had seen the man. On looking up to the timberline, they saw that he had returned and again was looking directly at the house. Rammer and Veda then became extremely upset and for a time let their imaginations run wild. Among the ideas that raced through their minds were that the man might be Joe in disguise, or it could be some snooping neighbor, or perhaps it could be someone Joe had asked to check on his wife, that Joe had asked to check on his wife for him. As soon as the man had gone back into the woods, Rammer got his gun and without saying a word about his intentions, slipped quietly out the back door. Between the woods where the man had been seen and the top of the hill was a sloping meadow. When Rammer reached the top of that hill from the backside and looked down toward the meadow, he saw the man and the dog coming directly toward him. When the man was about halfway across the meadow, Rammer shot him down. Unknown to Rammer, two boys who had been playing in the woods and had hidden in some bushes, on hearing Rammer's approach, saw the shooting. They immediately ran home and reported it to their parents, who in turn called the sheriff. By the time Rammer returned to Veda's house, the sheriff and a deputy were waiting for him there. With the two boys who had reported the incident leading the way, Rammer was taken by the sheriff and his deputy to the scene of the shooting. They found the man lying face down in the meadow where he had fallen, with the big shaggy dog lying beside him. Their efforts to check the man closely, however, were thwarted by the vicious attitude of the dog. Not wanting to harm or destroy it, they decided to wait and tried to find another way to retrieve the body. The sheriff and his deputy then took Rammer to the county jail to await further developments. 3 men of the community who had arrived at the scene proposed a plan by which the body could be safely removed. It was decided that one of the men would distract the dog's attention by getting it to chase him, while the other 2 would rush in and carry the body away. One of the men, Dieter Amos, volunteered to lure the dog away. Although he realized it would be a most hazardous undertaking, it was either to do that or assist in getting the corpse. He could not bear the thought of touching a dead body. Many times after this event, Dieter related in his inimitable manner what transpired at that time. When I approached within 20 feet of the body, Dieter recounted, that black shaggy dog growled and bared his teeth in a vicious manner. To me, at that moment, he looked as big as a full-grown grizzly bear. When it got in a crouching position, as if preparing to spring at me, I turned and started to run. I could hear it coming behind me as I ran at what I thought was my top speed. Then, when I looked back and saw that dog nearly on me and its teeth flashing at my heels, I tell you, I wasn't half running. Man, I took off like a bat out of Hades. When I came to a barbed wire fence, I sailed right over it and landed in a briar patch. By the time I got out of there, I saw our plan had failed. That dog was then chasing the men toward the other end of the meadow, and that dead man was still out there in the grass. Since it was nearly dark by this time, it was decided that no further effort to recover the body would be made before morning. It was hoped that the dog, on learning that its master was dead, would voluntarily wander away. Early the next morning, when the men returned to the meadow, they could find neither the body of the man nor the dog. All subsequent searches of the surrounding area failed to locate them. Also, that morning, word came from the sheriff's office that Raymer was dead. It was clearly evident he had been choked to death. His neck was swollen, and marks made about it by sharp fingernails were still clearly visible. Both the sheriff and the jailer emphatically stated that the jail had been locked all night and that it was impossible for anyone to have entered it without their knowledge. Even though the coroner admitted it was practically impossible for a person to choke himself to death with his own hands, nevertheless, he felt there was no other logical solution than to rule it as a suicide. Though there were some who thought otherwise, they sympathized with the coroner's position and that they realized how foolish it would make him appear in the eyes of the public were he to record that Raymer had been choked to death by a ghost. That's the end of story 4, y'all. All right, y'all, we're on story number 5, the prankish triplets. In the vicinity of the boundary line which separates Clay and Roane counties, there once lived a family with triplet sons. The 3 boys were so identical in appearance and mannerisms, their own mother was often confused over their identities. The boys learned very early of their ability to confuse others, and whenever it could be used to their benefit, either as individuals or as a group, would take advantage of it. In early boyhood, the triplets became ill with measles, and their mother became worried when they failed to break out as soon as expected. Since there was no doctor living in the community whom they could call in times of illness, the people had to try home remedies as the occasion might require. In this instance, after trying some of the more common remedies of the boys without success, the mother decided to brew up some sheep tea, an odoriferous concoction that was not only unpalatable but highly offensive to persons of a squeamish nature. As the mother approached the bed wherein the 3 boys lay, with a dose of the tea for the first one, they began to protest despite their wretched condition. She firmly seized the boy lying at the front side of the bed and poured a generous serving of the tea down his gagging throat. While the mother returned to the kitchen to get the next dose of tea, the boy in the middle quickly climbed over his brother and forcibly took front position, thus putting that already nauseated boy in line for the second dose. That's wrong. When the mother returned to the bedside, I'm sorry, y'all, the protests made by the child, now in the middle, were ignored, and he was promptly given another spoonful of the nasty tea. As soon as the mother left the room to get the final dose, the third son, on seeing the successful maneuver of his brother, now climbed into the middle position and shoved his ill-starred brother to the back side of the bed. On the mother's return to the bedroom, she was still unaware of the switching of positions by the triplets and demanded of the one at the back to take his dose as a dutiful son should. At this point, the other two sons responded to the aid of their mother by holding their brother while she gave him a third dose of tea. That poor bastard. I'm sorry, y'all. That's wrong. Anyways, it was said that the measles truly broke out profusely on all three of the boys, but no evidence was established on whether the one who was given the triple dose of sheep tea had more measles than his brothers. It is true, however, much to the chagrin of the victim of the prank, the other two derived more enjoyment in later years whenever they told, far and wide, the tale of their boyish prank on their brother. All right, y'all, we're on story number 6, Ramp Power. Uncle Lige Morris was well known for his high regard for the truth. Always judicious and circumspect in his speaking. He maintained a reputation throughout a long lifetime for reasonableness of thought and credibility, with one exception that defied his sincerity and made him uncomfortable to think about as long as he lived. The story he brought back from a trip through the Ramp Country in the central Alleghenies was so out of character for him to relate that his friends wanted some time to think about it before accepting it as fact. An act which Uncle Lige never forgot nor forgave. It was in early April in 1905, while in the prime of life, that Lige mounted his best saddle horse and rode across the Alleghenies to visit relatives in Greenbrier County. The trip over was uneventful. However, on his return, in an effort to follow a shortcut, he became confused and for some time wandered futilely through dense woodlands. Darkness came, and because of the danger of being struck by low-hanging tree limbs, he had to dismount and lead his horse. The trail soon became so steep and uneven, he felt it to be hazardous to walk in front of his horse, so he gave his steed free rein while he walked behind and held onto its tail. At length, they came out in the clearing on the mountainside where a large 2-story log house loomed up on a short distance ahead. It was here in the house that Lige found lodging for the night, a night which he wished many times later, for peace of mind, he had never known. As Lige lay in a comfortable bed in a room adjoining the living room, he could only reflect in amazement at the rapidity of the events that had transpired since his arrival here. In only a few minutes' time, his horse had been stabled and fed, he himself had been given food and drink, and then he had peremptorily ordered to bed. Throughout this time, other than revealing that his name was Sol Jenkins, his host had been practically uncommunicative. He could now hear him puttering about in the kitchen and occasionally muttering to himself. Despite his peculiar situation, Lige, bone-tired and weary from his trip, soon drifted off to sleep. Sometime later in the night, he awoke to the pungent odor of cooked ramps which nearly overwhelmed him. His bedroom door was slightly ajar, and on looking out, he saw 2 wizened old men with bushy white hair and unusually long beards sitting before the fireplace and engaged in an animated conversation. They talked in hoarse whispers, often punctuated with high-pitched whistling noises. On a table between them were 2 stoneware mugs, from which they occasionally took long draughts with gusto. After a time, their conversation gradually subsided, and then all was quiet again. The old men had fallen asleep in their chairs. Then Lige saw his host come in and pick up the men, one under each arm, and with their long beards dragging on the floor, carry them upstairs. The next morning, when Lige arose, he found his breakfast already prepared. He noticed, too, that his horse was saddled and ready for him at the front gate. So with haste he made his departure, and felt a great sense of relief once he was on his way again. About 2 miles down the mountainside, Lige came to another house where a man was in the woodlot cutting firewood. Here he learned more about the old men. The woodcutter informed him that Sol Jenkins was the son of one of the aged men and the grandson of the other. The 2 old men slept upstairs, remaining in a coma until the arrival of mid-April each year. Shortly after the stroke of midnight on April 15th, they aroused themselves from their long sleep, came down to their chairs before the living room fireplace, and while drinking ramp juice, talked about their experiences of earlier years. The older one often spoke of the time he spent as a Virginia militiaman at the Battle of Point Pleasant in 1774, while the other liked to tell of his exploits while serving under the command of Mad Anthony Wayne. On the basis of these claims, the older one was at least 150 years old, and his son was close to 130. Lige could only stare in disbelief when he was told that Sol, who appeared to be in his early 60s, was actually approaching the age of 100 years old. Moreover, it could be expected that he too would soon join his father and grandfather in the long sleep. Why do they sleep so much and live so long? Lige asked. Some people say it's the ramp juice. The woodcutter replied, They tell me those old men are so saturated in ramp juice they can't stay awake, and so well preserved they can't die. But I say there's more to it than ramp juice. I think they've sold their souls to the devil. And who will take care of them when Sol joins them in the long sleep? Well, I'm not waiting around to see. As soon as the roads are fit, I'm moving my family off this mountain. I tell you, there's something diabolical going on up here. When Lige returned home and related this experience to his friends, its reception was so poor, he never mentioned it again. But each year when springtime came and people began to talk about and prepare for ramp dinners, that faraway look would come into his eyes, and everyone knew he was wondering about the fate of the 3 old men in the mountains.